Some Christians believe that the Old Testament is mytho-history. That means they think that it's real history, there are real names, real places, but it's mixed in with exaggerations created by the Old Testament Jews. Why? So as to convey morals of the story to future generations. In other words, they believe that the Old Testament events and miracles, they are not all true. Some or all could be fables and myths. I'm making a whole video series to present the counter arguments to this so that you can conclude based on the evidence whether it's more likely or unlikely that the Old Testament is mytho-history. So in this video, we're going to look at the argument that the Old Testament is literally history because of what the Jews themselves believed. These are the Jews who wrote the Old Testament and who studied the Old Testament. So we Christians today have such a strong belief in Jesus because we have evidence of his life and resurrection. The historical case for Jesus' death, life, resurrection. In fact, there's even more historical accounts for this man compared to even the emperors of that time period. And for more historical evidence on why the case for Christ is so airtight, link is in the description of one of Lee Strobel's talks. That's for us Christians today, right? That's how we have so much confidence that Jesus is God. He did all those miracles and he resurrected. But how did the Old Testament Jews believe in God before Jesus came to do all these things? So similar to us today, it is due to evidence in their own history. And so this is main point number one that I'm making, is that the Old Testament often calls Israelites to remember God's mighty works and miracles of old. Why? Because whenever they remember it, it gives them faith, it removes their fear, it puts them on the right track, it gives them a fear of God. All these Old Testament verses that I'm about to show you would not say these to the Jews if they were not referring to literal events that happened in the history of the Jews to their forefathers. Deuteronomy 6:12. And take care lest you forget the Lord, who has brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So it's implying that Israelites being slaves in Egypt was a real historical event. Deuteronomy 8:2. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you. So their wandering in the wilderness for 40 years was again a real historical event based on the phrasing. Psalm 105 verse 5. Remember the wondrous works that he has done, his miracles, and the judgments he uttered. Psalm 104 verse 6 to 9. And this is actually talking about the flood in a poetry form. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so they might not again cover the earth. So this is also a good piece of evidence for why Noah's flood was real literal history. What we can see is that God did many miracles and divine intervention in literal history to give the Jews evidence for their faith, that there is a God and that he is the real God. If this Old Testament was partly fables or mostly fables, exaggerated, and the miracles were not as great, or maybe they weren't even miracles at all, it would sow doubt in the minds of the Jews, and their faith would be severely weakened. Here are more verses. Deuteronomy 7:18 to 19. You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand, and the outstretched arm. So it's referring to the 10 plagues. It's referring to how God brought them out of Pharaoh's grasp and oppression from Egypt. Joshua 4:22 to 24. Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So why did God do all those miracles? To let everyone else know, even the Gentile nations, that he is mighty, he is the real God. And it's also for his own people to fear and reverence God because they see evidence of his power, his glory, his might. And now here's point number 2 that I'm making. Jews' extreme reverence for God's name prevents them from making up stories about what he said and did. What God says is frequently recorded in those events. Now, if these are made up, it means whoever wrote them is putting words into God's mouth, seeing how much they reverence his name. And they never even dare to write it out. We'll get more into this later. It's unlikely that any Jew would ever do this. They would be very afraid of putting words into God's mouth. Exodus 20 verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. This isn't just about swearing and saying, oh my God, or like, God, whatever. It included misusing God's name in any way, including false prophecy or attributing untrue words to him. It created a culture of caution about how and when God's name was spoken or written. Here are more verses about not putting words into God's mouth. Deuteronomy 4:2. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. Deuteronomy 12:32. Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take from it. Proverbs 35:6. Every word of God proves true. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. Now I'm going to show you something from the Talmud. So the Talmud is a large collection of Jewish teaching, debates, and commentary on the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. And a section within the Talmud is Sanhedrin 90a. And this is something that I'm quoting from there. Anyone who says something in the name of the Holy One, blessed be he, which he did not say, is destined to fall into Gehinnom, which is hell. I hope I didn't pronounce that wrong. So I'm not an expert on Jewish history, these laws, so apologies if I pronounce it wrong. But what we can take from it is it shows how severely Jewish tradition viewed false attribution to God. To put words into God's mouth was seen to be a very grave sin punishable by eternal judgment. Now let's look at scribal tradition. Ancient Jewish scribes who would be copying the Old Testament would purify themselves ritually before even writing the name of God. Whenever they wrote the divine name, YHWH, they used a special pen, and if they made an error, they would bury the entire scroll, starting from scratch. In many scrolls, they would substitute God's name with the name Adonai, or they would leave a blank space completely, showing their extreme reverence. So the Jews' extreme reverence for God's name would prevent them from making up stories about what God said and God did. If they were just exaggerating events, adding a supernatural element when there was not, be putting a lot of words in God's mouth, attributing actions and mighty works that he did not do. And this really goes contrary to how the Jews feared and revered even God's name because of fear of blasphemy. So the Jews who wrote the Old Testament, by the inspiration of God, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, it does not make sense that they would come up with fables and stories for fear of committing blasphemy. And now to my third point, which is a word to Christians who are believing that the Old Testament is mytho-history. So I say this out of love. Please analyze and research into what anyone tells you, even what I'm saying in this video. So when people tell you that, oh, it's, mytho-history, it's fables, it was just to teach the future generations morals of the story, but it's not actually true, then what you're doing is you're calling God a liar because he's writing words in the Bible through inspiration of the prophets about things he didn't do. That's called lying. Next, you're putting a cap on God. Now, a reason that I hear a lot of the time of why these were likely not literal historical events is because they're too supernatural, too many miracles. But think about it, why couldn't he keep, for example, Jonah alive in the belly of the fish for 3 days? Why couldn't he actually have caused a worldwide flood? He created the universe from nothing. That is the greatest miracle that has happened in the history of the universe. Keeping Jonah alive is child's play. Getting a big fish to swallow him is child's play. A worldwide flood is child's play. Think about the resurrection. You Christian who says that the Old Testament is mytho-historical. You believe that Jesus Christ did many miracles, right? You believe that he rose from the dead and that was a miracle, right? What is stopping this God who created the laws of physics from anytime tampering with this reality that he created, from breaking those laws and doing things that are supernatural? What is stopping him? So why couldn't he have done all those miracles in the Old Testament, bringing Israel out of Egypt by all those signs and wonders like the 10 plagues? Just because it's supernatural or unfathomable to you doesn't mean God is limited by your expectations. So after all, you believe in Jesus, right? You believe his resurrection. So why this inconsistency in your thinking? Why apply it to one place but not another, which is the Old Testament? Next, you are undermining the reliability of the Bible which you claim to believe in. But if we don't know which parts are true history and which parts are exaggerated history, how can we trust anything that the whole Bible says? How can we trust anything the Old Testament says? Are you going to just throw it out and only look at the New Testament? So the good news is that there is tremendous archaeological evidence, meaning researchers, they dig up those historical sites and then they find pieces of evidence which keeps on backing up what the Old Testament records, adding to its reliability. I am compiling the best evidences, the best videos that I find on YouTube which answer these things, which puts the evidence in a concise manner, and I'm putting them all in a big database. So I will share this Notion database. Anyone can view it. Please share it with other Christians and skeptics also. It will be in the description of this video. So in there you can look at the historical evidence that verifies the Old Testament, such as 10 plagues, Pharaoh's tomb, Joshua's eye, and Jericho, the archaeological evidence for that, which I'll be making future videos on. I hope this video was helpful and strengthened your faith and shows you that Christianity is a faith that makes sense. If you like this kind of thing, please subscribe to support the channel. To get more of your doubts answered and to strengthen your faith, watch this next video here.